The heavy clanking of machinery echoed through the vast industrial warehouse, accompanied by the rhythmic hiss of steam pipes and the occasional spark from welding stations. The factory, Harrison Steel Works, was one of the oldest and most reputable manufacturers in the Midwest. From the outside, it seemed like just another industrial facility, grimy, functional, and ordinary. But tonight, something unusual was happening inside. Among the workers, men in grease-stained overalls and heavy boots, was a man who didn't quite belong. He moved with precision, his hands steady as he adjusted the settings on a complex piece of equipment. He wore the same uniform as the others, yet his presence was subtly different. His eyes, sharp and calculating, darted around the room, taking in every detail. That man was Clint Eastwood. To the untrained eye, he was just another factory worker, blending seamlessly into the workforce. But in reality, he was here on a mission, one that could change everything. It all started 2 weeks ago when a factory supervisor named Henry Lawson vanished without a trace. One day he was at work overseeing production lines as usual. The next he was gone. No phone calls, no notes, no signs of forced disappearance. The company executives claimed they were investigating, but rumors spread fast. Some workers whispered that Henry had uncovered something dangerous, something the higher-ups didn't want him to reveal. The local authorities did a cursory investigation, but with no evidence of foul play, the case was quickly dismissed. However, not everyone was convinced. Henry's best friend, Tom Wilkins, had been suspicious from the beginning. That's when Tom reached out to Clint Eastwood. Clint wasn't just a legendary actor and filmmaker. He was a man with a reputation for getting things done. Over the years, his off-screen activities had earned him a reputation as someone who could see through lies and uncover the truth. When Tom told him about Henry's disappearance and the shady dealings happening at the factory, Clint didn't hesitate. He knew something wasn't right. So he did what no one expected. He got himself hired as a factory worker. For the past week, Clint had worked tirelessly alongside the other employees, studying their routines, listening to their conversations, and, most importantly, watching. He noticed how certain workers seemed nervous, always glancing over their shoulders. He saw how a group of executives frequently visited the factory at odd hours, always meeting behind closed doors. But tonight, something felt different. There was an unusual tension in the air. The workers were quieter than usual, their movements hurried and stiff. Something was happening, and Clint could feel it. He wiped his hands on a grease-stained rag and made his way toward Tom, who was hunched over a blueprint in the corner of the workshop. "Something's off tonight," Clint muttered, keeping his voice low. Tom glanced around nervously before responding. "You noticed too? There's been a lot of extra security lately, and I overheard something strange earlier. Two of the managers were talking about moving a package at midnight." Clint's eyes narrowed. "A package?" Tom nodded. "That's what they called it. But the way they were whispering, I don't think they were talking about factory supplies." Clint's mind immediately went to Henry. Could he still be alive? Was the package actually referring to him? He checked his watch. It was 11:45 p.m. Whatever was happening, Clint had 15 minutes to find out. Clint's heartbeat remained steady, but his mind raced. 11:45 p.m. If something was happening at midnight, that gave him only 15 minutes to figure out what the package was and whether it had anything to do with Henry Lawson's disappearance. The factory was massive, with dozens of storage rooms, underground tunnels, and hidden corners. If something, or someone, was being moved, he had to find them before it was too late. Clint turned to Tom, his voice calm but urgent. "Where did you hear them talking about the package?" Tom wiped his sweaty hands on his overalls, glancing around nervously. "In the break room, near the loading dock entrance." Clint nodded. That made sense. If they were moving something in or out of the factory, the loading dock was the most logical place to do it. He started walking toward the back of the factory, keeping his movements casual. Around him, workers focused on their tasks, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. Machines clanked and hissed, drowning out most sounds. But Clint had trained himself to listen beyond the noise. And that's when he heard it. Footsteps. Not the casual, tired steps of factory workers heading home. These were purposeful, coordinated, and heavy. Clint ducked behind a stack of metal crates, pressing himself into the shadows. He peered around the edge just as two men in dark suits passed by. They weren't dressed like factory workers. These men were outsiders. Security? Enforcers? Or something worse? Their hushed voices carried just enough for Clint to catch fragments of their conversation. "He's in there now. Boss said to move him tonight. Too risky to keep waiting." Clint's eyes narrowed. They were definitely talking about a person. The two men continued down the hall, heading toward a restricted section of the factory, one Clint hadn't been able to access yet. He needed to move fast. Clint glanced at his watch. 11:50 p.m. 10 minutes. Taking a deep breath, he slipped out of the shadows and moved silently through the dimly lit corridor. He knew every step had to be calculated. One wrong move, and he'd blow his cover. Ahead, he saw a steel door with a keypad entry system. One of the suited men punched in a code and the door clicked open. Clint memorized the sequence. 5-9-3-2. The men entered and the door began to close behind them. Clint moved quickly, catching the door just before it locked. A narrow escape. Inside, the atmosphere changed immediately. The air was damp and cold, with a faint hum of electricity. The room was a storage area, but not for equipment or materials. Instead, it held rows of locked metal cages, and inside one of those cages, Henry Lawson. He was slumped against the back wall, his hands bound, his face bruised and exhausted. But he was alive. Clint's stomach tightened. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just about factory corruption. This was something much bigger. Before Clint could react, a voice echoed through the room. Well, I was wondering how long it would take for you to show up." Clint turned slowly. A man stepped forward from the darkness, dressed in a crisp suit, his expression unreadable. Richard Hale, the factory's chief executive. Clint had suspected he was involved, but now it was confirmed. "I gotta say, Mr. Eastwood," Hale continued, "I didn't expect a Hollywood legend to get his hands dirty in a place like this." Clint's gaze remained steady. "I go where the truth takes me." Hale chuckled, stepping closer. The two suited men from earlier flanked him, their hands resting on their concealed weapons. "You should have minded your own business," Hale said. "Henry here found something he shouldn't have. And now, so have you." Clint didn't move. His instincts told him exactly where this was going. Hale had no intention of letting him walk out of here alive. But Clint Eastwood had faced worse odds before, and he wasn't about to back down. Clint Eastwood stood facing Richard Hale, his cold gaze locking with Hale's. The air inside the room tensed like a knife's edge. There were only 3 men in the room, Hale and his 2 associates. But Clint knew that even these 3 could pose a serious threat. Henry Lawson was still inside the cage, slumped weakly on the floor. Clint had to get him out of there. But first he needed to figure out Hale's game. Sharper than words. Clint kept his eyes fixed on Hale as he spoke. "Then tell me," he said, "what's here worth all this trouble?" Hale smiled. "You're a smart man, Eastwood, but asking too many questions can sometimes bring trouble." Clint shrugged. "I'd prefer not to ask, but sometimes the answers come up to my nose." Hale's eyes narrowed. He didn't like Clint's defiant tone, but Clint knew he was trying to get under the man's skin. The angrier Hale got, the more vulnerable he'd become. Hale shook his head. "Did you really think this factory was just about metal production?" Clint raised an eyebrow. "What, you running a secret gold mine here?" Hale chuckled softly, but there was a dangerous gleam in his eyes. "Something more valuable than that. Information." Clint's inner detective sprang to life. "Did Henry uncover the wrong information here?" he asked. Hale shook his head. "Exactly. And anyone who chases the wrong information disappears." Clint did the math in his head. If Henry had discovered information and been locked up for it, that meant Hale wasn't just a con artist, he was part of a much larger criminal network. But Clint still didn't have the most important answer. What exactly was this factory about? And he couldn't get Henry out of there until he knew. Escape plan. Clint scanned the room carefully. Hale and his men were all focused on him. They hadn't drawn their guns yet, but it was only a matter of time. He had to do something. Clint took a step toward Hale. "So what do you plan to do with me?" Hale shrugged. "A Hollywood star like you disappearing would raise too many questions. So, we'll have to make it look like an accident." Clint sighed. You don't need to talk this much to kill me, friend. At that moment, Clint reached into his pocket and dropped the metal bolt he had prepared earlier onto the floor. Clank! The sound of metal echoed through the room, causing the three men to momentarily divert their attention. In that split second, Clint moved. He used his whole body to shoulder-check one man, sending him staggering back, then quickly reached for the other's gun. The man's finger was on the trigger, but Clint was faster. Bam! Clint struck the man's arm, knocking the gun to the ground. As Hale began to retreat, Clint caught the gun midair and pointed it straight at him. Hale's face no longer wore a smile. "You don't have the guts to kill me," Hale said, his voice trembling. Clint tilted his head. "You think I'm just trying to scare you?" Hale's eyes widened. Clint's calm demeanor clearly terrified him. But Clint knew he couldn't afford to linger. He still had to get Henry out of that cage. Rescuing Henry, Clint kept the gun trained on Hale as he moved toward Henry. The cage was locked, but that wasn't an obstacle for Clint. He scanned the room and spotted a metal rod leaning against the wall. He grabbed it, slid it into the lock, and put all his strength into it. Click! The lock broke. Henry slowly lifted his head, gratitude in his eyes, though still exhausted. "Buddy, we're getting out of here," Clint said. Henry nodded and struggled to his feet. Just then, one of Hale's men attacked Clint from behind. Clint reacted just in time, sidestepping the punch, though the blow grazed his shoulder. The pain registered, but it didn't slow him down. Clint quickly drove his elbow into the man's chin. Bam! The man collapsed to the floor and Clint grabbed Henry by the arm, guiding him toward the door. But he knew more men were waiting outside. Time was running out. Henry asked, "Is there a way out?" Clint squinted. "I noticed a few paths when we came in, but I'm not sure." Henry flashed a small smile. "I'm sure. Follow me." Clint and Henry stepped into the dark corridor, but the men on their trail were already moving. Escaping wouldn't be easy, and Clint knew this was just the beginning. Clint Eastwood and Henry Lawson rushed down the dimly lit corridor, their footsteps echoing through the empty factory. The air smelled of oil, rust, and something Clint couldn't quite place. Something sinister. Behind them, Hale's men were in pursuit. The moment Clint and Henry had escaped from the holding room, alarms had begun blaring throughout the building. They were running out of time. Henry led Clint through a maze of hallways, moving with the confidence of a man who had studied every inch of the place. "I worked late nights here for months," Henry said, slightly out of breath. "I know every hidden door, every unused passage." Clint nodded. That knowledge might be their only way out. But as they turned a corner, Clint pulled Henry back abruptly. Two guards stood near a steel-reinforced door. Henry's eyes widened. "That door leads to an old maintenance tunnel. It can get us out of here." Clint narrowed his gaze. The guards were armed, and while Clint had taken a gun from one of Hale's men earlier, he knew that engaging in a firefight here would bring even more trouble. He needed to be smart. Looking around, he spotted a stack of heavy crates balanced precariously on a high shelf. An idea formed in his mind. "Henry," Clint whispered, "stay behind me." Clint raised his gun, but instead of shooting at the guards, he aimed at a rusty chain holding the stack of crates together. Bang! The chain snapped, and in an instant, the crates came crashing down. Thud! Crash! The impact was deafening. The guards barely had time to react before they were buried under wood and metal. Clint smirked. "That'll keep them busy." Henry wasted no time. He rushed toward the steel door, pulling out a set of keys from his pocket. "I swiped these from the foreman's office weeks ago," he explained. The lock clicked open. Henry pushed the door, revealing a narrow, dark tunnel. But before they could enter, gunfire erupted behind them. Hale's voice echoed through the hallway. "Eastwood! Lawson! There's nowhere left to run!" Clint turned to see Richard Hale standing at the end of the corridor, flanked by 5 armed men. Hale's face was twisted in rage. "You think you can just walk away?" Hale sneered. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Clint took a step forward, raising his gun. "I know enough. You're running an operation that shouldn't exist. You're silencing anyone who finds out. But here's the thing." He cocked the gun. "I don't scare easy." Hale chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a tough guy, Eastwood. But let's see how tough you are when you're full of lead." Before Clint could react, Hale pulled out a remote control and pressed a button. Boom! The wall shook violently. Sparks erupted from overhead lights. Pipes burst, releasing steam into the air. Henry grabbed Clint's arm. "He's blowing up the tunnels. He'd rather destroy everything than let us leave with the truth." Clint gritted his teeth. He had seconds to make a decision. The tunnel behind them was the only way out. But Hale and his men stood between them and survival. Then Clint did what he did best. He took control of the situation. He fired 2 quick shots at the overhead pipes. Bang! Bang! Scalding steam burst out, engulfing Hale's men. They screamed, dropping their weapons and stumbling backward. Clint rushed forward with Henry close behind. Hale, caught off guard, tried to raise his gun, but Clint was faster. With one swift punch, Clint knocked Hale to the ground. Hale groaned, his gun skidding across the floor. He reached for it, but Clint stepped on his hand. Hard. "You're done," Clint growled. Hale's face twisted in pain. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Clint crouched down, locking eyes with him. "That's where you're wrong." Then, without another word, Clint grabbed Henry and ran toward the tunnel entrance. The tunnel was long, dark, and narrow. Henry led the way, navigating with ease. Behind them, the factory rumbled as explosions continued. After what felt like forever, they finally saw light ahead. They emerged in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The night air was cool, crisp, and filled with the distant wail of sirens. Clint turned to Henry. "We made it." Henry nodded, taking deep breaths, but his face was grim. "We need to expose Hale. We need to tell the world what's really going on in that factory." Clint smirked. "Oh, don't worry. I have a few friends in high places who'd love to hear this story." As sirens grew louder, a row of police cars pulled up. Officers swarmed the area, guns drawn, taking in the scene. One officer, a detective Clint recognized, stepped forward. "Eastwood? What the hell happened here?" Clint dusted himself off. "Long story, but let's just say you'll want to check out that factory before it all comes down." The detective nodded, signaling his men. As Clint and Henry stood there, watching the chaos unfold, Henry turned to Clint. "So, what now?" Clint grinned. "Now, we go have a drink." Henry laughed, shaking his head. "You really are something else, Eastwood." Clint tipped his imaginary cowboy hat. "I do my best." And with that, the 2 men walked away, victorious. The factory was finished. Hale's reign was over. And Clint Eastwood had once again proven that he was more than just a Hollywood legend. He was a man who stood up for what was right.